What if a single, forgotten piece of parchment could change everything we thought we knew? Imagine a letter, penned not by a follower, not by a devotee, but by a renowned historian of the ancient world, a letter that lays bare the very image of one of history's most enigmatic figures, Jesus of Nazareth. The promise is intoxicating, isn't it? A perfect description of Jesus, straight from the pen of Flavius Josephus, the celebrated Jewish historian who walked the earth in the 1st century. It's a claim that's surfaced in various forms over the years, whispered in online forums, cited in passionate discussions. The idea of a lost letter that could give us an unvarnished, contemporary snapshot of the man who would change the course of history. Hi everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating, and frankly, quite complex topic: the alleged descriptions of Jesus attributed to Flavius Josephus. We'll explore what Josephus actually wrote, why the idea of a perfect description is so appealing, and what rigorous historical inquiry can tell us. This isn't just about debunking or confirming, it's about understanding our own deep-seated desire to connect with the past, and how we navigate the often blurry lines between historical fact, tradition, and outright fiction. So grab your thinking caps, because we're going on an intellectual adventure. The core idea that a video titled something like Letter from Flavius Josephus perfectly describes Jesus would explore is undeniably powerful. Why? Because for billions, Jesus is a figure of immense spiritual significance. Yet, the New Testament, our primary source for his life and teachings, offers remarkably little in terms of his physical appearance. We get glimpses of his actions, his words, his impact on people, but no detailed portrait. Was he tall? Short? What color were his eyes? His hair? This void has been filled over centuries by art, tradition, and sometimes by texts of questionable origin. We've seen Jesus depicted with long, flowing brown hair, often fair-skinned, a gentle expression, an image heavily influenced by European artistic traditions. But is this historically accurate? The desire for a concrete, eyewitness description from a non-biblical, respected source like Josephus is therefore immense. It feels like it could cut through centuries of interpretation and give us something real, something tangible. And let's be honest, there's a part of us, I think, that craves certainty, especially with figures who mean so much. If Josephus, a man known for chronicling Jewish history for a Roman audience, had indeed penned a detailed description, it would feel like discovering a lost photograph. It would seem to offer a direct line to the past, bypassing the complex layers of theological interpretation and faith. But as with all historical claims, especially sensational ones, we must ask the crucial questions: what is the evidence? And is it reliable? To understand any claim about Josephus, we first need to understand who he was. Born Yosef ben Mattatyahu around 37 CE in Jerusalem to an aristocratic priestly family, he was a fascinating and controversial figure. He was well-educated, involved in Jewish politics, and initially a commander in Galilee during the First Jewish-Roman War, the Great Revolt against Rome that began in 66 CE. Famously, after being captured by the Romans, he prophesied that the Roman general Vespasian would become emperor. When this came true, Vespasian spared his life. Josephus then became a Roman citizen, taking the name Flavius Josephus, Flavius being Vespasian's family name, and lived out his days in Rome under imperial patronage, writing his historical works. His major works are the Jewish War, an account of the revolt, and Antiquities of the Jews, a history of the Jewish people from creation to his own time. He also wrote Against Apion, a defense of Judaism, and an autobiography, The Life of Flavius Josephus. These works are invaluable for historians. They provide one of the few contemporary, non-biblical perspectives on first-century Judea, the political climate, various Jewish sects, and key events. However, Josephus was also writing for a specific audience, Romans and Hellenized Jews, and had his own biases and agendas. He was, in some ways, an apologist, trying to present Jewish history and culture in a favorable light to the Roman world, and also to justify his own controversial actions during the war. So, Josephus is a critical source, yes, but not an infallible one. Like any ancient historian, his work needs to be read critically, cross-referenced with other sources, like archaeology and other texts, and understood within its specific context. He wasn't just a neutral chronicler, he was a participant, a survivor, and a writer with a perspective. This is crucial when we evaluate anything attributed to him. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. Did Josephus write about Jesus? Yes, he did. The most significant passage appears in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3, Paragraph 3. This is famously known as the Testimonium Flavianum, the Testimony of Flavius. I'll read the version most commonly found in manuscripts. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. This passage is one of the most debated in ancient literature. Why? Because while most scholars accept that Josephus, a non-Christian Jew, did mention Jesus, they also widely believe that this version has been subject to Christian interpolation, meaning, later Christian scribes copying the text likely added phrases to make Josephus sound more like a believer. Think about it. Would Josephus, who remained a Jew and was writing for a Roman audience, unequivocally declare Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, or state the resurrection as a fact? It seems highly improbable. Phrases like if indeed one ought to call him a man, he was the Christ, and the direct affirmation of the resurrection sound much more like Christian theological assertions than the writings of a non-Christian historian. This doesn't mean the entire passage is a forgery, but rather that it was likely enhanced by later copyists. Scholarly consensus generally leans towards a partial authenticity view. Many believe there was an original, more neutral passage by Josephus, which was later embellished. Some scholars have attempted to reconstruct what Josephus might have originally written, stripping away the overtly Christian phrases. For example, a widely accepted Arabic version, quoted by the 10th century historian Og Pius, is much more reserved. It reads something like, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. And his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." This Arabic version, while still debated, sounds much more like what a neutral or even skeptical historian might record, reporting on Jesus' reputation, his following, his execution, and what his followers claimed. It's a report, not a confession of faith. The difference is crucial. The Testimonium, even in a more original form, tells us that a figure named Jesus existed, was known as a wise teacher and miracle worker, gathered followers, and was crucified by Pilate. This is historically significant. But it's not a physical description, nor is it the glowing endorsement found in the commonly transmitted text. There's also a second, less controversial reference to James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ in Antiquities Book 20, which further supports the idea that Josephus knew of Jesus. But again, no physical description, no perfect letter. So, if the Testimonium Flavianum, even in its interpolated form, doesn't offer a physical description, where does this idea of a letter from Josephus perfectly describing Jesus come from? The truth is, there is no such authentic letter known to mainstream historical scholarship. If such a letter existed and was verifiably from Josephus, it would be one of the most sensational historical discoveries ever, and you'd see it analyzed in every university history department and seminary worldwide. Its absence from serious scholarly discourse is telling. Often, what happens is that other apocryphal or forged texts get misattributed or their contents conflated. One famous example of a text that does provide a physical description of Jesus is the so-called letter of Publius Lentulus. This purported letter, supposedly from a Roman official, Lentulus, a supposed governor of Judea preceding Pilate, a figure for whom there's no historical record, to the Roman Senate, describes Jesus in detail. His hair the color of wine, his beard, his eyes, his stature, his gentle yet commanding presence. This letter sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It's exactly what many would hope for. However, scholars universally recognize the Lentulus letter as a medieval forgery, likely dating from the 13th or 14th century. Its language, anachronisms, and historical impossibilities clearly place it much later than the 1st century. It reflects medieval European ideals of appearance rather than any authentic 1st century account. Why would someone forge such a letter? Well, the Middle Ages saw a burgeoning interest in the life of Jesus and a desire for more details than the Gospels provided. Forgeries were not uncommon in the ancient and medieval world, sometimes created for pious reasons, sometimes for political gain, sometimes to fill in perceived gaps in the historical record. The donation of Constantine, for example, a forged Roman imperial decree used to bolster papal authority, is another famous instance. It's possible that in popular imagination, the idea of Josephus wrote about Jesus gets mixed up with the content of forgeries like the Lentulus letter. Someone might hear that Josephus mentioned Jesus, and separately hear about a letter describing Jesus, and then incorrectly connect the two. This is how misinformation can spread, especially online where context and scholarly rigor are often lacking. Let me share a related example of how eagerly people seek tangible connections. Consider the Shroud of Turin. For centuries, this linen cloth bearing the faint image of a crucified man has captivated millions. Is it the burial shroud of Jesus? The debate rages. Scientific analyses, like radiocarbon dating in 1988, pointed to a medieval origin. Yet many faithful still believe in its authenticity, and further scientific studies continue, often with conflicting interpretations. My point here isn't to definitively say whether the shroud is authentic or not, but to illustrate the profound human desire for a physical link to figures of great importance. A letter from Josephus describing Jesus would tap into that same deep yearning. Or think about how family stories get passed down. My grandmother used to tell a story about her great-grandfather meeting a famous historical figure. Over the years, details would shift slightly, perhaps get a bit more dramatic with each retelling. It wasn't malicious. It was human nature, wanting to make the connection more vivid, more impactful. Ancient texts, copied by hand over centuries, were susceptible to similar, though often more deliberate, modifications, especially when powerful religious or political ideas were at stake. So, why this persistent hunger for a perfect description? I think it stems from several places. Humanizing the divine/iconic. A physical description makes an abstract figure more concrete, more relatable. It helps us imagine them as a real person who walked the earth. Seeking validation, for believers, an external, non-biblical confirmation of Jesus, especially one detailing his appearance in a way that perhaps aligns with traditional imagery, can feel like a powerful validation of their faith. The power of eyewitness testimony. We instinctively place a high value on eyewitness accounts. The idea of a contemporary like Josephus providing one is incredibly appealing. Filling the void. As mentioned, the canonical Gospels are sparse on physical details. Humans have a natural tendency to fill in missing information, to complete the picture. Furthermore, our mental image of Jesus is so heavily shaped by centuries of art. Think of Warner Sallman's Head of Christ, one of the most reproduced religious images in history. For many, that is Jesus. But that image itself is a product of a specific artistic tradition and a 20th century interpretation. These artistic depictions, while powerful and meaningful for many, aren't historical photographs. They are expressions of faith, culture, and artistic convention. The search for a Josephus description might be, in part, a subconscious desire to find historical grounding for these beloved, culturally ingrained images. It's also about our relationship with history itself. We want to know. We want to peel back the layers of time. And sometimes, in that eagerness, we can be less critical than we should be, especially when a claim aligns with what we want to be true. So, if there's no perfect letter from Josephus describing Jesus, does that mean Josephus is useless for understanding the historical Jesus? Absolutely not. The, likely partially authentic, Testimonium Flavianum and the reference to James are still incredibly important. They are among the earliest non-Christian attestations to Jesus' existence, his reputation, his following, and his execution under Pilate. This is solid historical data, even if it doesn't give us the visual details we might crave. The real value of historical inquiry isn't about finding a single magic bullet text that proves everything. It's about the painstaking process of source criticism, evaluating who wrote a text, when, where, why, and for whom. Textual criticism, comparing different manuscript versions to get as close as possible to the original wording and identify later additions or alterations. Corroboration, looking for multiple, independent sources that attest to the same information. Contextualization, understanding the historical, cultural, and social environment in which events occurred and texts were written. This critical approach is what separates history from myth-making or wishful thinking. It's what allows us to build a plausible, evidence-based understanding of the past, even if that understanding is sometimes incomplete or doesn't match our preconceived notions. The absence of a Josephus letter describing Jesus' appearance doesn't diminish the historical impact of Jesus. It simply means we have to look to other types of evidence and be comfortable with certain ambiguities. Think about it. What if such a letter did exist and described Jesus in a way that completely contradicted all traditional imagery? Say, if it described him as short, bald, and with a booming laugh. For some, that might be deeply unsettling. Our attachment to certain images can be very strong. True historical inquiry requires us to be open to evidence, wherever it leads, even if it challenges our assumptions. So, to recap, Flavius Josephus was a real and important first-century historian. He did mention Jesus in his writings, providing valuable, early non-Christian evidence for his existence and execution. However, the idea of a specific letter from Flavius Josephus perfectly describing Jesus is not supported by mainstream historical scholarship. Such detailed descriptions that do exist, like the letter of Publius Lentulus, are widely considered later forgeries, created to fill a perceived void and satisfy a human longing for a more tangible connection to this pivotal figure. The quest for the historical Jesus is a fascinating and ongoing one. It involves sifting through complex texts, archaeological findings, and understanding the nuances of ancient cultures. It's a journey that teaches us as much about ourselves, our desires, our biases, our ways of interpreting the past, as it does about history. So, what's the key takeaway here? I believe it's the importance of critical thinking and historical literacy. When confronted with compelling claims, especially about figures or events that evoke strong emotions, it's vital to ask, what is the actual source of this information? Is that source reliable and contemporary, or is it from a much later period? What do experts in the field, historians, textual critics, archaeologists, say about it? Could there be an alternative explanation for this claim or text? Approaching history with an inquisitive and critical mind doesn't diminish its power or its meaning. In fact, it enriches our understanding. It allows us to appreciate the genuine complexities of the past and to distinguish between well-grounded historical knowledge, evolving traditions, and the understandable human desire to see, to know, and to believe. Thanks for joining me on this exploration. If you found this interesting, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What other historical mysteries or claims would you like to see us tackle? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the incredible tapestry of our past.